Hello and welcome to the TriDoc podcast. My name is Jeff Sankoff, an emergency physician, multiple Ironman finisher, and your host, the TriDoc, coming to you from beautiful, sunny Denver, Colorado. Before I start the show, I wanted to get in a couple of housekeeping items. First and foremost, I owe you all an apology. My schedule has been really quite difficult over the past few weeks with a lot of travel and other obligations, and that all conspired to delay this episode of the podcast. I very much appreciate your patience and hope that it will have been worth the wait. Although I was unable to keep to my schedule for the pod, I wasn't completely unproductive during that time. Rather, I was able to get going on another project that I've been wanting to do for some time, and that was to get some video content onto my YouTube channel. For my first offering, I have posted a brief video review of my dedicated travel bike, the 7 Cycles Earhart Pro, and discussed the benefits of investing in a bike like this if you are someone like me who travels pretty frequently and doesn't like to forego the riding when you get to your destination. Of course, there are a lot of ways to transport a regular bike, but my custom, easily packed in a standard suitcase bike is an attractive option, and I give some insights as to why I went that route. In coming weeks, I have additional videos planned that I will announce on my Instagram and Twitter feeds, as well as here on the podcast. To find the video, go to YouTube and search for my channel by typing TriDoc, one word, in the search bar. And don't forget to subscribe so that you'll know each time I post something new. In addition, I'll put a link in the show notes. Please do check out my website for coaching, www.tridoccoaching.com. If you're looking to take your training and racing to the next level, maybe we can work together to get you there. Finally, once again, I'd like to thank all of you who have taken the time to leave a rating and a review wherever you download the show. If you haven't yet done so, please consider it, as this is the single best way to increase the visibility. On today's podcast, Daimeon Shanks, a former mechanic on bicycling's world tour and owner of the Boulder Service Course, a must-visit bike shop according to Bicycling Magazine, joins me to talk about his experiences with pro cyclists and triathletes, as well as his transition to academics and his new life as a lawyer, although he maintains many of the relationships that began on the roads of Europe, North America, and even Kona. The triathlete Routard returns to triathlon after a visit to Europe for the Spring Cycling Classics. On this episode, I'll be taking you to one of the oldest and most popular races on the WTC circuit, Ironman Lake Placid. There are a lot of excellent reasons for this race's success and continued favored status amongst triathletes, and with the addition of a September 70.3 race on the same route, there are now 2 opportunities to head to the Adirondack region of upstate New York and take on this challenging and scenic course. Before all that, though, I have a medical question to answer, and this one comes from someone near and dear to me. After a recent 5K, my son and I were walking through the exhibitor booths when he noticed a distinctly medical-appearing one, belonging to a company that offers mobile intravenous hydration services. Why would anyone need that, my son asked me. Why indeed? I answer him, and anyone else who might be pondering the same thing right now. If you are a regular listener of the podcast, then you know that one of my pet peeves is businesses that market themselves to unsuspecting consumers, especially athletes, as offering a product or service that is purported to be beneficial to a performance or recovery, when in reality they are no more than snake oil salesmen, experts at cashing in without delivering. Even more egregious are those that misrepresent themselves as having the backing of medical science or medical professionals in order to facilitate their being able to dissociate athletes from their hard-earned dollars. I encountered the latest example of this at the end of a recent local running race here in Denver. After the event, my family was walking through the exhibitor expo munching on our post-race snacks when my son Adam came across the booth for a mobile intravenous hydration company that operates in the city. What, he wondered, was this all about, and why were they here? He's only 9, but already he follows after his old man in being appropriately skeptical about these kinds of things. These companies have become quite popular over the past 5 to 10 years, especially amongst college students who tend to have a proclivity towards, shall we say, the overconsumption of alcoholic beverages on weekends, leaving them somewhat under the weather on Sunday mornings. IV Hydration Company sprang up to provide a service that was heretofore unneeded, to provide rapid rehydration as a hangover cure right in the home. No need to get out of your onesie pajamas or even out of your own bed. IV Hydration Services would come to you, administer a liter of normal saline, and get you feeling right as rain. Never mind that a hangover is related to more than just dehydration, and that there's no scientific evidence to support this treatment. Hungover people in many cities were all too happy to shell out $60 to $130 to give it a go. But not content with their already astonishing profit margins, a liter of normal saline is very inexpensive, the companies began to develop cocktails of vitamins to be administered with the fluids that, according to them, would add to the restorative effects of the saline and cure hangovers even more quickly and effectively. Again, no evidence, but in their hungover state, none of the customers seemed to be in the mood to check. Alas, there are only so many intoxicated people to hydrate on a weekend, and only so many will do it more than once, most because they wise up and don't drink so much after the first time, and others because they realize that the IV did little more than make them pee and lighten their wallet. So the hydration companies needed to expand their potential customer base. And so someone must have thought, who else is dehydrated out there? And so someone landed on the idea that this should be offered to athletes as well. Google IV hydration companies, and you will find any number of these operations, and invariably they will market themselves as a viable option for athletes who are, quote, having trouble recovering, end quote, or are, quote, feeling a little tired, end quote, or just need some extra hydration for whatever reason. And similar to how they expand their offerings for hangovers, these companies now offer all manner of cocktails for athletes as well, with lots of dubious claims of benefits. So what exactly is the deal with intravenous hydration? Is it a good thing, a bad thing, or just kind of neutral? And what about all those vitamins? Do you need to consider having the local IV hydration truck coming around while you're drinking your morning cup of joe and reading the paper before your long ride? As you might expect, I'm not going to have too much positive to say about this whole concept, so best to keep your money where it belongs, with you, while you listen to the rest of the podcast. Now, there isn't a whole lot of high-quality research on IV fluids versus oral fluids in athletes, but what there is out there is remarkably consistent. Sometimes, even when there is a paucity of data, when it all points in one direction, it kind of discourages doing additional studies, since it's so unlikely to find a different answer, and in this case, there really doesn't seem to be a big problem to solve. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a little bit. Now, the concept behind IV hydration is really pretty simple. By placing a catheter into a vein and administering fluids directly into the bloodstream, you can theoretically restore body fluids more rapidly and efficiently than you can if you use oral rehydration alone. The reason for this relates primarily to the limits of the human digestive tract and its ability to handle fluids. For example, while it's possible to get a liter of fluid intravenously into the body in about 10 to 20 minutes, depending on the sizes of the vein and the needle used, the rate of fluid consumption of the gut is variable and depends on the time it takes for the stomach to empty, how concentrated the fluid being ingested is, and certain characteristics of the gut itself that can influence absorption rates. There's also the fact that of the fluids ingested, only about 50 to 60% is actually absorbed into the bloodstream. Still, even with those limitations, it's possible to rehydrate completely, even when in a significantly dehydrated state, by oral rehydration alone. And so long as a person is tolerating oral fluids, numerous studies have demonstrated that in medical causes of dehydration, such as diarrhea or kidney problems, oral rehydration is preferred over IV hydration in every instance. This is because using the gut has other important effects, such as triggering important hormonal cascades and suppressing the thirst reflex that IV hydration does not. So as I said before, there doesn't seem to be a big problem here in need of solving. We can hydrate ourselves orally just fine. One of the reasons you don't see a lot of research in this is for that reason. There isn't a big issue here that needs fixing. For athletes, though, the allure of being able to hydrate rapidly is enticing, and so a handful of studies have looked at this modality with respect to its impact on various outcomes. I'll address a few in turn. IV hydration prior to exercise has been looked at in a couple of small studies and found to demonstrate no effect on exercise performance. Despite this, I should note that the use of IV hydration is banned by the World Anti-Doping Agency, so even if the studies weren't negative, the WADA ban would still be a pretty good reason not to do this. Believe it or not, IV hydration during exercise has also been studied, using cyclists on stationary bikes. In that study, cyclists received IV hydration or took oral fluids and cycled to exhaustion in a controlled environment. There, once again, IV hydration conferred no benefits to performance. Though I should mention once again that IV hydration is banned by WADA, IV poles are really not that aero, so hydrating this way while on the bike, again, not a great idea. IV hydration has also been looked at as a way of preventing or resolving exertional muscle cramps, even though numerous studies have shown no relation to either hydration status or electrolyte concentration to cramping. Unsurprisingly then, IV hydration studies have also not been shown to have any impact on cramping. Hydration between sessions of exercise has been looked at as well. In these kinds of studies, athletes perform exercise for a specified duration to become dehydrated to a specified amount, and then are rehydrated with IV fluids before doing a second session of exercise, where their performance is compared to a group of athletes who rehydrated with oral fluids or with a group who did not rehydrate at all. Unsurprisingly, when compared to athletes who did not rehydrate at all, athletes rehydrated with IV fluids showed a performance benefit. But that benefit disappeared when compared to athletes who rehydrated with oral fluids, showing once again a lack of any benefit of IV over oral hydration. IV rehydration has also been looked at with respect to temperature environments, in other words, environments where it's very hot. And in these studies, there's some kind of interesting conflicting results. IV rehydration has been shown to lower skin temperature in athletes who exert themselves in warm environments, but their performance metrics are unchanged when compared to oral rehydrating athletes. So, not entirely sure what's going on there. The IV rehydrated athletes seem to have some metrics which would suggest a benefit, but again, when you look at their performance, there's no difference when compared to oral rehydration. Lastly, IV hydration has also been looked at as a hydration modality after a competition has completed. In marathoners, the use of IV hydration was actually associated with increased muscle soreness and a delay to return to activity when compared to oral rehydration. Now, it should be said that the IV hydration group in this study was not identical to the oral rehydration group. Those who received IV hydration tended to be amongst the faster runners than those who got oral rehydration, so this may have played a part in the findings. But other explanations are related to the need to sit still for the time period for getting IV fluids and other factors that may not have been totally well understood. So based on everything that I've said, I think that you'll agree when I say that there's really no role for IV hydration for athletes whenever they can take fluids by mouth. And that leads me to the one time when IV fluids are indicated, and that is when oral fluids are not tolerated for any reason in the setting of dehydration. And in fact, this is exactly the stance that Ironman takes and that many other major medical associations take when they administer IV fluids to athletes at the end of races. IV rehydration is always used as a last resort. Any athlete who presents to a medical tent at the end of a marathon or at the end of an Ironman race is always encouraged to try oral rehydration first and foremost. Only in cases when oral fluids are not tolerated is IV rehydration then used as a last resort. So for many of you who might be considering one of these mobile hydration services for whatever reason, I'm not here to judge about what you do with your weekends after all. Let me at least help you save your money and not make the call. There's clearly no benefit to anything they have to offer, and that includes all of the vitamin cocktails, which I didn't even touch, but the research is very clear on that as well. Because you can get exactly what you need simply by drinking for much, much less. Do you have a health or medical related question for me to consider for answering on the podcast? Well, please email it to me at tri_doc@icloud.com. My guest today is Daimeon Shanks. Daimeon began his career as a mechanic in pro cycling in 2005 with USA Cycling. In 2006, he joined the fledgling Slipstream team and spent 5 years with them as they grew to the Pro Tour outfit, now known as Team EF Education First Cannondale. Subsequent to his time on the road, he worked for numerous pro outfits on a part-time basis, including the BMC and Cannondale Factory Pro mountain bike teams, the Rafa Focus, Cannondale Cyclocross World, and Noosa Pro Cyclocross teams, as well as individual support for professional triathletes. Daimeon has experience working in the Grand Tours of Europe, including the Giro d'Italia, World Championships, World Cups, the Kona Triathlon World Championships, and the 2012 London Olympics. In 2010, Daimeon, along with another former Pro Tour mechanic, Nick Legan, opened the Service Course, a service-oriented bike shop that catered to high-end clientele in the Boulder area. Nick left the shop in 2012 to pursue a career in journalism, while Daimeon grew the thriving business, which was named one of Bicycling Magazine's top 29 must-visit bike shops in 2015. Despite this success, Daimeon took what appeared to be a precipitous decision and closed up shop in 2016 and entered law school at CU Boulder. Daimeon studied public international law, international human rights, indigenous peoples law, legal history, and critical legal theory. Daimeon was a member of the Colorado Law Review, and in the summer of 2018 served as the legal aide to the chair of the International Law Commission, a suborgan of the UN General Assembly in Geneva. He recently graduated from CU with certificates in American Indian law and international law. And this fall, he's headed to the University of California, Berkeley to pursue a PhD in jurisprudence and social policy with the aim of beginning a career in academia. But right now, I am very happy to say that he's joining me on the TriDoc podcast. Welcome, Daimeon.
Good morning, Jeff. Thank you for that lovely and quite extensive introduction.
Yeah. Well, if the shoe fits. So is it okay if I call you Damo? Because that's really how I know you.
Absolutely. It's funny. Everyone in the cycling world knows me as Damo, which is an Australian shortening of my name, which I was given, I think, pretty early on in my cycling career, around 2006 from, I don't even remember which one, but some Australian member of the slipstream sport.
So I want to go back. I definitely want to touch on everything we just talked about, but let's begin right at the beginning. How did you come to the world of pro cycling?
Well, I grew up bike racing. I've been racing since I was 14. So what does that put me like? Well, let's just say quite a long time at this point. So I raced through college, and I had aspirations. I wanted to be a pro cyclist, but everyone has a genetic ceiling, and I was good, but I wasn't quite that good. So I bounced around at some bike shop jobs, and there's actually Mark Legg, who I raced against in college. I don't know if you know Mark Legg, Katie Compton's husband, who's a Kiwi and also was a former pro mechanic. A chance encounter with him at a bike race. There was an opening at USA Cycling at the Olympic Training Center down in Colorado Springs for a staff mechanic, and I jumped at that chance. I worked with USA Cycling for about a year with the U.S. national track team, running camps out of there. Briefly, I was the head mechanic for USA Cycling, even though I was woefully unqualified at the time. And at that point, let's see, this would have been the fall 2005. Jonathan Vaughters, who was running the slipstream team, or started the slipstream team. At that point, it was called TIAA CREF, Teachers Insurance and Annuities College Retirement Equity Fund. They had a track team, and I met JV at a track race and helped some of his riders out of a tricky situation. And from there, in early 2006, he called me a week before the Tour of California started. I think that was the initial Tour of California. Might have been the first one. I think it was the first one or the second one. But their mechanic had just quit, and he said, "Hey, you want to pack up your stuff and move to Boulder and come start this race with me in a week?" And I jumped on that, and I spent 5 years with that team, and that was the start of my pro career.
Wow. So as in so many things in life, being in the right place at the right time, meeting the right people, really important.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, right. And then you just sort of parlayed that and just kept going with your meeting different pro people and then getting to the Giro and all those other high-end races, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I did it full time for 5 years. Then after that, really burnt out. It's quite a lot of work being on the road. As you can imagine, it'd be 200 plus days a year on the road. So about 2010, I was pretty burnt out. So Nick and I decided to open a bike shop, and I like to say it was my idea, but really it was Nick's. Nick had the genesis for the idea of doing a service only bike shop. He'd seen one in Australia that was doing quite well, and we thought that would be a nice little niche market in Boulder, where there's so many high end cyclists and such a thriving scene here that people really. There was a desire, there was a need for really good mechanics that could do work quickly, not something that you have to drop your bike off for 3 weeks at a time, but also at a reasonable price. And so we really kind of filled that niche, and the business was great.
Yeah, I mean, as a former client, I could say the niche was definitely, very much appreciated. I drove all the way from Denver whenever I needed anything because you knew the service was great. And like you said, rapid turnaround, great price, and the personal part of it was really the best. So I'd love to hear some, funny stories or some things that you might remember from your time on the tour and even from your time in the shop. I mean, the kinds of things that people must have come by with.
Where to start?
Yeah, exactly. Where to start?
This is a G-rated podcast or PG?
There's no rating yet, so I think we're good.
I have a lot of fond memories of my time on the road, for sure. I mean, a lot of fond memories. One of my favorite riders from back in the day was Tyler Farah and I got on like a house on fire. He's just a wonderful person, down to earth. It's really funny. By the time you get to the Pro Tour, most bike riders don't have a lot of an ego, which is odd, but I think it's such a slog. It's so hard to get to that level that any kind of pretext of being an ego-driven, self-centered person just kind of goes out the window. It's really those mid-level riders that tend to have bad egos. But anyways, Tyler is one of my, one of the closest people that I had on the team. There was one time, I think it was 2007, during the U.S. Pro Championships in Greenville. There was kind of a fad going around at the time called flipping beds, and I don't know if you're aware of this. I don't know if it was a long-standing fad, but Greenville was a very hilly race, so Tyler wasn't one of the main favorites for the race. So maybe 3 or 4 days before the race started, we got a little bit inebriated, I won't lie, and we decided that we're gonna flip some beds. So somehow, a little bit drunk, we talked our way into getting a room key for one of our other mechanics, Tom Hopper, who has had a long career with Slipstream, and also with Rafa Focus. He was Jeremy Power's personal mechanic. So we bust into his room and flip his bed and this other mechanic, and that was kind of funny. They took it pretty well. And of course, being young and dumb, we were not finished at that stage. So somehow we went back to the front desk and convinced them that we were Tom Danielson, who was one of the team leaders. And this may not have been the best idea at the time. So we managed to get the key, and I don't even remember how. Like I said, I might have been a little inebriated. And so we were at the front door trying to open up his room. And the key wasn't working for some reason. And it's this like 1-2 o'clock in the morning, a couple days before US Pro Championships. And we're fiddling, all of a sudden the door opens and Tom's just standing there, like, "Hey guys, what's up?" And we were so taken aback. He was in such a good mood. He's like, "What are you guys doing?" And we're like, "Oh man." Now we feel bad. We're gonna bust in and flip your bed. He's like, "Oh, that's funny. That's hilarious. That's awesome." We're looking at each other like, aren't you mad? Aren't you like pissed off at us? He's like, and he said, and then I'll never forget this quote. He said, "No, I'd be mad. You guys are my friends." The most awkward silence after that. We're like, "Okay, well, good night." Go back to sleep. And so, yeah, I guess that was one story. That was by far not the only time I've been drunk with some of the riders, but
I'm glad to hear that that goes on, because you get the sense that they're in bed at 7 and up the next morning at 6 on the trainer immediately, and that it's all strict by the rules and curfew and everything else. And I'm glad to hear that they're having fun, because it looks like nothing but pain and suffering for that is definitely a myth.
Yeah. they're just people too. Some of them super young, they have to blow up to steam and have fun. And I've met a lot of great people through my years.
And is there a lot of camaraderie between the teams?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, some people are just jerks. There's no two ways around it. But for the most part, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're seeing the same people day in, day out for, up to 100 days a year at the races. So like, these are people you get to know really well, especially among different staffs. I obviously had a lot more interaction with other staffs, other mechanics, but every day, during a stage race, we'd have to do the same rigmarole, pack up, do the race, or transfer to the hotel, figure out where the washing was, figure out where the hoses were, what the setup was, where we're going to park our rigs. So these are definitely people that you made a strong connection with. And obviously, Nick, who I started the bike shop with, the service course, is one of those people. He had worked for Radio Shack with Lance and a couple other Pro Tour teams. And when I met him, he was working for HealthNet, and we were kind of on the same schedule, running around America, washing bikes and hanging out in parking lots. And not only did I have friends in the Pro Tour circuit, I would say that my best friends now are former pro cyclists that that I made connections with. One of those obviously being Alex Howes. I don't know if you're familiar with, or if you know of Alex. He's
of course, yeah. He's in a breakaway almost every day.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of his MO. So I met Alex. I mean, in 2006 when I first started working, he was a junior on the TIA craft team. I met him as a 17-year-old, and he always impressed me with his maturity. And we ended up becoming very close friends. We lived together for quite a number of years in Boulder. And then recently he moved to Netherlands, bought a house up in Netherlands last summer, and I moved up there this January. So I'm actually in Alex's house right now. He's probably my best friend in the world. I had the honor of marrying him and his wife last fall. Yeah, I was a priest for a day. It was pretty cool.
Ah, that is pretty awesome. Yeah. So, like you say, I mean, it's those kinds of relationships from the day in, day out kind of grind that really do form the friendships that can last forever. So that is an impressive part of the job, if you will, that goes on. So that's a really nice story.
I'm sure, as you know, as a doctor, you really get to know people when you're in a stressful situation, and I'm definitely not comparing bike racing to saving lives in the ER. But the stressful situations, and like you really get to know who a person is in those kind of.
Yeah. When you're with them day in and day out, and having to adapt, like you said, and trying to figure things out together, you definitely that's a stress to itself for sure. What about triathletes? I always hear that. Pro triathletes, and certainly my experience meeting pro triathletes, the few that I've met, they seem to be at a different level. Just they're much more approachable. They don't seem. I mean, they're not in the same financial situation that a lot of cyclists are. What's been your experience dealing with them over the years?
For the most part, great. Yeah, I think this kind of at least an undeserved reputation I think cyclists give triathletes is complete hogwash. I mean, for the most part, they're all down to earth. They're very nice. They're very friendly. They just want their stuff to work well, and especially at the highest level, it's very disparate from the situation of professional cyclists. Professional cyclists have teams with mechanics, and the teams take care of all the bikes, and they have loads of bikes. Professional triathletes, even at the highest level, unless they're lucky enough to have some kind of industry support, they're on their own, and they have their bike, they have their 2 or 3 bikes, and they have to take care of them themselves. And I really found a lot of the professional triathletes at the highest level, the tri bikes are very complicated. They just want them worked on and worked on well. They're not afraid to pay the money. They're not afraid to do what it takes to keep their bikes running, because it's the tool of their job. It's just the nature of the beast that I think most bike shops and most mechanics aren't, quite up to the level of being able to maintain a professional tri-bike at the kind of level that a professional would need. And so I ended up working with a lot of professional triathletes just because I could provide that service. Very few of them even got a discount from me. Some I was happy to, some were still close friends. But a lot of them just wanted their bikes worked on by somebody who was competent and who could, stand behind their work instead of taking it to just a random bike shop. And there's plenty of great mechanics at bike shops around the world. I'm not trying to, be completely full of myself, but there is kind of a trust that you build up and a rapport you build up with athletes who really need their bikes to work on their race day, because that's how they make their money. So I remember one of the first triathletes I worked with was Tim DeBoom. Who's just a lovely guy, really helped me a lot. We started a relationship, and that really started me in the tri scene in Boulder, which is obviously huge. Tim DeBoom, one of my early customers and close friends, is Flora Duffy. Let's see here, Cam Dye, I worked with quite a bit. He was a great friend, still a great friend, obviously. Recently retired, and he's doing great in his new job. I mean, the list goes on. People that I've worked with, it's pretty, again, I sound like I'm bragging, but
no, not at all. I mean, it's pretty awesome. I mean, the thing I love about triathlon is the pros race the same course as we do, and they know that, and they are very approachable. I mean, it's been one or two triathlon pros that I have, tried to approach who really were very standoffish. The vast majority who I've run into just, at random in airports or in coffee shops or whatever, or out in Boulder at Mary's, stopping to get some water or whatever. They're always just the most amazing people. And so I'm not at all surprised to hear that you had the same experience working with them. But it's interesting you mentioned Cam Dye retiring, because that's the next thing I wanted to ask you about is, with your, if you will, retiring from that scene, which was devastating to me, left me in a lurch. I couldn't believe you did that to me, but that's besides the point. Was law always something that you were thinking about in the back of your mind, or did that kind of evolve over time?
Well, first, thank you. I'm sorry.
You owe me no apology.
No, not really. Around 2015, 2016, I'd done a lot in cycling. I've had a long career. I was making great money. I had lots of friends, had a great community in Boulder. Life was easy, and frankly, I was kind of bored. I wasn't really challenged that much anymore, and really, I was not fulfilled or satisfied with my life. I wasn't finding that I had a lot of meaning. So law was not something that I thought about for a long time. Really, it was law or medicine, to be honest with you. And I didn't want to do a residency.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
And the irony is not lost to me that now I'm continuing in school for another 4 years. Yeah. But that being said, so it was kind of a fluke. I decided, why not study for the LSAT and see what this law career is about. Managed to get into Colorado Law, which is a great law school. Didn't hurt that some of the faculty at CU Law were also my customers, which is pretty funny. And really started. So yeah, it was really a fluke. It was really just a way of challenging myself mentally as much as anything else. And man, I fell in love with it. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. I don't regret my life leading up to law school at all. I was definitely an older student. I was 36 when I started law school 3 years ago, which is very old for a law student. But I don't regret it at all. It's probably the best decision I ever made.
Yeah, you only go around once, and I mean, you do what you can when you can, and it doesn't matter. I mean, I've always said age is a state of mind. It's just a number. So, yeah, good for you for doing that when you did it. I think it's wonderful. And I'm curious about the choices you've made. How did you come to American Indian law?
Oh, well, just in general. So when I decided to go to law school, I didn't want just another job where I was making money, right? Because I was making great money at the bike shop. I had a business. It was that my life was easy. So I really wanted to do something that would help other people. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to have meaning in my life. I wanted to live for others. So American Indian law, particularly, our school is an amazing American Indian law program with professors like Carla Fredericks, Kristen Carpenter, who's on the UN's expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people. Our dean, Jim Anaya, whom I'm working for this summer and I would consider a friend, is the former UN special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people. I mean, Charles Wilkinson, who is really instrumental in the legal battles in the 70s that really established a lot of the precedent for American Indian rights in the U.S. We just have an amazing program here. So, of course, I wanted to take advantage of that. I was also interested in international law, having traveled in Europe quite a bit. I just find it fascinating, international law and international human rights for that same aspect. So let's see, it really started in my second year. The first year of law school, everybody has to take the same courses, and you're kind of pigeonholed that way, as I'm sure Kim Kardashian is figuring out right now. But starting my second year, I worked for the American Indian Law Clinic, and I worked on basically a case that our dean, Jim and I, had initiated in the late 90s with the Maya indigenous people in Belize, trying to secure legal title over their traditionally occupied lands and property. And so I spent a year working with them, and man, I just love I love being able to help people, and I was helping people in the bike life, but not in the same way. When you can really make a difference with kind of this even basic legal training. There's a need for that in a lot of these underserved communities, and yeah, man, I found a lot of meaning in that.
Well, that's terrific. I'm so happy for you, and I'm happy for everyone that you're helping because, like you said, they are a very underserved population. I see that in my line of work, working at a inner city safety net hospital, and I definitely can understand exactly where you're coming from with those sentiments. Daimeon Shanks is a former Pro Tour bike mechanic. He had a very successful bike shop in Boulder called the Service Course, and he has gone on to a law career, which I am quite confident is going to be equally successful. He begins a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley this fall, and is hoping to pursue a career in academia. Daimeon, thank you so much for joining me on the TriDoc podcast today.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me. It's great talking to you, and congrats on on all your successes.
Thank you so much. In France, they have a popular guidebook for travelers called Le Routard, and it covers everything that you would ever need to know about innumerable destinations around the world. On this podcast, I have what I call the triathlete Routard, as a means of trying to give you some of the same important salient tips and tricks to help you, my listeners, navigate some of the more popular races on the Ironman and Ironman 70.3 calendar. Today, I am joined by friend and emergency medicine colleague Jeff Beckman to discuss the logistics, course, and overall experience of Ironman Lake Placid, and as much as we are also able, Lake Placid 70.3. Jeff raced in Lake Placid last July and placed first in his age group to secure his second trip to Kona. He's had an incredibly successful career at both the 70.3 and Ironman distance, and this year is turning his attention to the international distance, competing at the World Championships in Lausanne, Switzerland, and to Xterra, where he will be in Maui in October for those World Championships as well. For now, though, it's my pleasure to welcome Jeff to the podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. Happy to be here.
Ironman Lake Placid, it's one of the oldest on the calendar and has a tradition of being one of the more difficult ones as well. What's the situation on signups? Is this one that you can kind of wait to pull the trigger, or is this one you really got to plan far in advance?
That's interesting, Jeff, because when I was there, I ran into several athletes, and they were like, well, there used to be a time for Placid where if you didn't register the day of the race for the next year, you wouldn't get in. So certainly things have changed, and actually just looking at it, there is still some openings, which this is a course that has historically sold out, not only just the first day, but usually within 24 hours. So, which is a shame because the course is really amazing.
And that's my recollection as well. This was, it was at a time when there weren't that many races, so it's not all that hard to understand now that there are so many choices, and especially at that time of year, there are several other races around. Lake Placid, not the easiest place to get to. We'll get to that in a second. But looking at the 70.3, which is in September, I see that one's open as well. Although I should note that both of these races right now, and we're recording this in March, right now both of them are at the final tier of pricing. So they're probably approaching full, but there is still time. So speaking of logistics, how do you get there? I know I'm from Montreal originally, and getting to Lake Placid was a little bit of a chore. I actually drove down there to meet my sister-in-law. We rode the course one year, and it's a beautiful drive, but it's a long one. So how did you get there going from Colorado?
It is. That's interesting. Yeah, so we did have the option between Montreal and Burlington was another place, and so we wanted to hit Vermont, so we went through Burlington in that direction. And it's amazing how big the Adirondacks are. That was surprising. The size of it's bigger. It's not technically a national park, but more of a national forest. But the size of it is bigger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, and I believe Rocky Mountain National put together. So that's how expansive the forest is. So,
and much of the roads cutting through it are 2-lane, which means you're not moving that fast.
Yes. Yeah. So it's but it's amazing, undulating wilderness, and right when you get into the protected forest, it's just a beautiful landscape. So.
And how long was the drive from Burlington?
So the Burlington drive was approximately 3 hours.
Yeah, and it's about the same going down from Montreal.
From Montreal, yeah. So
and if you do choose to fly into Montreal, you, of course, have to cross the border, which is a very small border crossing in Plattsburgh, New York. It's easy, but like any border crossings, it's still a border crossing. Where did you stay?
So I would recommend to stay at the Crown Plaza, Lake Placid. And the nice thing about it is it's a little bit removed from Mirror Lake area where all the race logistics and everything happen there, where you climb up just a really small hill, but you have this picturesque view of Mirror Lake. So when you're up there, you can see almost the entire course, and you can see how tranquil the water is. So if you're ever someone that gets a little psyched out by the complexity or the conditions of a swim, if you sit up here and look at this tranquil water, then it just completely eases any type of fear going into this. So it was a nice place, and it's an easy walk just to all of the headquarters where Ironman is housed there. So.
And being a small New England town, I mean, all your options, VRBO or small hotels, they all were pretty clustered together from what I saw.
They are, yeah. It is nice to be on Mirror Lake if possible. So my father stayed in a town about 15 minutes away, and especially logistics on race morning are very challenging. So that's just one thing to consider, is if you have family or even yourself or getting to the start race morning, if you're outside of the town, it certainly is a lot more challenging. So it's nice to be pretty close.
So as much as you can, stay within walking distance.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a good tip. While you're there, are there any must-see attractions or must-do activities before or after the race in the area?
Well, I felt the Olympic Museum was just amazing. So they had Olympics there in 1932 and 1980. And, of course, everyone remembers the Miracle on Ice, where the U.S. beat the Russians in the semifinal, which is still touted, I think, as the upset of the century. And there they highlight that certainly that match, but also just the history of the races there. And so that's a not missed site. And the easy thing is it's right actually adjacent to where the Ironman Central is. So that is pretty easily accessible. The other things are, looking at the ski jump is also a pretty fun activity. And just you can walk to the top of that and looking down, and it is just harrowing to imagine someone would actually drop into that and jump. So that was pretty neat. And actually I looked down that and I'm like, you know what? Just doing a swim and a bike and a run doesn't sound that bad, and much more doable.
And they have both the large and the small hills.
They do,
Wow.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So those are all places that are easily accessible. The ski jump is a slight drive, and actually that's part of the run course where you'll go by it. So
Okay.
it's not to miss.
Well, let's turn our attention to the course just a little bit. I have heard all kinds of legend about the swim, both because the water is so pristine, as you've mentioned, but I've also heard tale of almost a lane line that you can follow for the whole course, which sounds too good to be true. But you're about to tell me it actually is true, aren't you?
It is true, and coming from the perspective of a mediocre swimmer who likes to keep my head down, you can literally on the first lap just follow this cable that goes underwater about 3 or 4 feet and not necessarily have to sight one bit, which is unheard of. And but it just follows the entire course. So I think
so it's actually placed there.
So it's
for
there.
the race.
It's there. I believe it's there all year round. So this course is this cable that goes underneath the water is there pretty much most of the year, from what I've heard. Again, that's not confirmed, but either way, it is amazing to have a guide essentially to follow the entire course. Which for me, I mean that was able to record my best swim. Now, the other thing about that is that it's not a secret, so everyone gravitates to where that line is.
Yeah.
So on the first lap, if you can create some space and get in a small group, that's really great. Now, on the second lap, then you catch up with all the other swimmers because it is a rolling start.
Okay, so that was one of my questions. It's not a mass start. It's not an age group start. It's a rolling
start, right? So that just be prepared on the second loop. You'll have a lot of traffic, and everyone is jonesing to get close to that line right there that outlines the course. So most of the swim splits are going to be certainly slower on the second round. That's where the pros were, and even the pro that won it, Heather Jackson, I believe, swam just over an hour, which for a pro is a pretty slow swim. But interestingly, a lot of the age groupers were not too far off that.
And is it a long beach run in between the two loops?
No, so the beach run is fairly short, which is good, but the long run really happens is after you finish the second loop to get the transition, you do have to run from Mirror Lake to the town. So that's somewhere approximately about a 0.3 mile.
Yeah.
So the nice thing is at least it's carpeted, so they have a long carpet that you run on, but it is fairly significant. So coming into that race, it is a good idea to practice a small run barefoot after you do your swims.
And it looks like the 70.3 is the same swim. It's just one loop instead of two.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So T1, you just mentioned the lengthy run into T1. Other than that, any particulars or particularities about T1 that would be different from other races?
No, it's pretty straightforward. They have so many volunteers there that they mostly have volunteers actually able to go grab your bike and bring it over. So that wasn't the case of mine because they couldn't read my number because I washed out. So that's another thing is make sure that your number is on pretty well so the volunteers can help call out your bike. But the nice thing about the run into T1, another thing just to mention too, it is downhill, so you're not having to do a significant climbing. So.
And are the wetsuit strippers located when you come out of the water, or are they located when you get to T1?
Get to T1.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the bike. The bike is pretty legendary, mostly for the second half of the loop. Having ridden the course myself, I did one loop as just a pre-ride with my sister-in-law who was training for the race. I can attest it is not to be trifled with. The beginning of the ride is fairly straightforward, and there's a very long and fast descent. I wasn't thrilled with the road conditions. Are the roads open while you're racing?
So the roads are open on some parts of the course, and when I initially looked at it, it looked like it was somewhere right around 5,000 feet, but actually, in reality, when I looked at my my trip computer afterwards, it was 6,500 feet
total.
Yeah, total.
Not per loop. It was total.
6,500 total, and that was with the last year in 2018 they did revert to the original course. So
right.
There were a couple of small modifications, but in either way, the courses go through. I think that the key thing is coming down Keene.
Yeah.
So there's a significant downhill. And so being very comfortable with taking the downhill at good speed is really key. The road conditions, were fairly good in my mind. The only problem that day is when I raced it, it was raining, and there was also some sleet, so that certainly changed the whole dynamics, and also made the downhill to Keene a lot more treacherous.
Right. Yeah.
But for the most part, the way that the grade is, you can actually run that pretty high and with good speed because there is a run out at the bottom and the turns aren't too treacherous.
Yeah, I remember it being pretty. You could see the turns coming.
Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward. Yeah. And then the climb, as you mentioned, when you come back on that loop is up Whiteface.
Yeah,
and so that's where it's just a long, slow climb.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, where a lot of people burn a lot of matches.
And I would especially imagine it's really like you cannot go too hard that first loop. I mean, if you're doing the 70.3, basically the 70.3 is one loop of the course.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a different approach, obviously.
Absolutely.
But you do got to save your legs for that run. But if you're doing the Ironman, you got to get to the top of that hill and then do the whole thing over again. And I just remember there's, after the downhill, you've got sort of this long kind of rolling, pretty fast, straight, and then you do this long out and back. I can't remember what the name of the town is. You turn around at this town, you come back, and then you make this right-hand turn, and that's where you start climbing. And you just climb pretty much relentlessly all the way back to transition for, it felt like a good 20 miles. Yeah. But what I will say is the course is spectacular. I mean, it's one of the prettier courses that I've ridden on. How much crowd support is there out there?
Well, I mean, it's just in most of this area is fairly remote roads. So you'll see some folks as you go into Keene. Hasselton Road is that one where you go out and back, and that's kind of the long rolling. And then you'll find some folks just there at that junction. But really, most of the crowds are going to be at around Mirror Lake. So you do have a lot of time out there, but the good news is it's beautiful terrain, and you go over smaller lakes, rivers, and very, very picturesque. And so it makes the suffering a little bit easier.
Yeah. Aid stations, enough of them, well stocked?
Yeah, well stocked. And then being a 2-loop course, I think it's nice because you can expect and plan where the second one is, and fully stocked with all the standards and Ironman races. So.
And then, one of the things with 2-loop courses is there's always the potential for stacking up and drafting. Did you encounter a lot of that?
So on this, I mean, I didn't. And I think it just, the helpful part of that was a rolling start. And so with that rolling start, I think it did spread out the course quite a bit. And there was good space with the difference between the climbing, the straight rollout, and then certainly the downhill at Keene. There's either you're going hard or you're hitting the brakes, and so there seemed to be a lot of space. So not quite the drafting that we both saw at the Kona World Championships. Yeah.
Any danger points? I mean, the downhill is definitely a potential if you're not comfortable descending. Anything else on the bike course worth noting as a potential danger point?
There is one point at Whiteface Mountain with a turnaround. So that is when you come back and you're starting that long climb that we had mentioned. There is a slight turnoff that you do to Whiteface Mountain and then come back.
Yeah.
And that is something that a lot of folks, I think, miss as far as how far you have to go up.
Right.
So that's certainly one area to scout.
Okay.
Because it's fairly steep up, fairly steep down, and then knowing exactly where that turnoff point is helpful because the road there is not quite as solid as the rest of the race. So.
All right. Let's shift our attention to, before we get to the run, T2. I mean, is T2 the same as T1? Is it the same location?
Yeah, same location.
Okay. And then the run, also not noted to be one of the easier runs, apparently quite rolling. The 70.3 is, again, one loop. The Ironman is 2, so same course. What kind of advice would you have for people doing this race?
So the run is something I felt was very straightforward, and the nice thing is having the 2 loops is you get to go through the town twice, and that's where you can really feed off a lot of the energy. The area around Mirror Lake is is not very much of a climb, so where you get the climb is on the way back just before town. When I came in, I was expecting about 1,500 feet, and then actually my watch said it was closer to about 1,000 feet total elevation and climb. And really out there, I didn't feel that it was much as far as in regards to a long, prolonged climb that I had an issue with. The big thing is just to save yourself on that last climb into town, because I think a lot of folks start to feel the energy of the town. There's a small climb and really push it and burn some matches. So just take that slight climb back up to town at a moderate pace so you don't burn out. And I saw a lot of folks cramping near Mirror Lake because they just took that climb up the town a little bit too hard.
And the finish is at the Olympic Oval?
Well, at the Olympic Oval, so you get to actually run by the same Olympic Oval that they had in 1980 Olympics, which is pretty dramatic finish. And the crowds are packed there, and it's unlike any other in North America.
That's great. Looking at the weather, it looks like you had really one of the best days, even with some rain, of the last several years. The high of the day tends to be anywhere from low to mid 70s. This is the Adirondacks, though, as you mentioned earlier, and so it can be a pretty chilly morning. The lows can be anywhere from high 40s up to sort of mid 50s. You were really lucky last year. The low was 69, so you definitely benefited from a really perfect weather day. Doesn't tend to be very windy, although last year it looks like there were some gusts that were pretty high. The other big thing about the alpine weather is, of course, the risk of showers and even lightning. And I know there's been problems in the past with the swim having to be either shortened or canceled on 1 or 2 years because of freak lightning storms. And that's just something you have to kind of take into consideration anytime you're doing a race in an alpine environment. And looking at the 70.3, less of a track record, but over the last couple of years, they've had pretty consistent weather since they've hosted this race. It does start quite chilly in the low 40s, so definitely going to want to have warm clothing for that. And then the high is high 50s to low 60s. So if you're somebody who does not like to race in the heat, this one definitely looks like it could be one for you. Absolutely. Any other final sort of thoughts or tips for this race?
No, just plan to have some time to enjoy the area around, and so I think that's one of the magical parts of this location is just the amazing wilderness that it offers in this area. So, not to be missed.
All right. Yeah. Jeff Beckman is an emergency physician here in Denver, Colorado. He is a multiple Ironman finisher and was the age group winner at Lake Placid, in his age group at Lake Placid, 13th overall finisher last year in 2018. Thanks again so much for being here today on the podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. My honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
And that's it for another episode of the TriDoc podcast. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. Links to the medical references, as well as to everything else discussed on the show, can be found in the show notes at www.tridocpodcast.podbean.com. If you have feedback or a question for consideration to be answered on the program, please email me at tri_doc@icloud.com. If you're interested in coaching services, please visit www.tridoccoaching.com, where you can find a lot of information about me and the services. The music heard at the beginning and end of the show is Radio by Empty Hours and is used with permission. This song and many others like it can be found at www.reverbnation.com, where I hope that you will visit and give small, independent bands a chance. The TriDoc podcast will be back again soon with another listener question for me to answer, another interview with Tim Crowley, a USAT certified coach and strength conditioning expert, and another episode of the triathlete Routard with a guide to the Ironman and 70.3 races in Mont-Tremblant, Quebec. Until then, train hard, train healthy.